In the earlier panels we had looked at the second option for the V'natati Nega Tzarat, God's involvement in causing a Nega Tzarat to develop in one's home, that of the Zohar, and the thesis of Omek Hara, that there was a Ruach Mesa'ava, a Ruach HaTuma, that existed in Eretz Canaan, and therefore if Eretz Canaan was to become the dwelling place, metaphorically, for the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then this Ruach Mesa'ava, the Ruach HaTuma, needed to be eradicated, and this came about by way of a Nega Tzarat, causing the physical buildings to be contaminated. They then had to be renovated and destroyed in some cases, and rebuilt. The weak link in this line of thinking is that theoretically every dwelling in Eretz Canaan would have to undergo this process, and if this be the case, one would have expected that there would be some reference, even by way of a hint, in the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. This led us to conclude that the V'natati Nega Tzarat was limited in scope, that the Nega Tzarat had surfaced in a limited number of buildings, which begs the question that if the Ruach Mesa'ava permeated throughout the entire land of Canaan, why did not each and every house have to go through a renovation to remove the Ruach HaTumah? To this difficulty, the Rebbe suggests that the Ruach Mesa'ava, the Ruach HaTumah, was not binary, that it was not either Kadosh or non-Kadosh, rather that there were a range of degrees within the Ruach Mesa'ava. And I shall now digress to take a closer look at the Ruach Mesa'ava and then return back to the core text of the Sikha. Kabbalah delineates two distinct types of KELIPAH. KELIPAH, which translates as a shell, is synonymous with the Ruach Mesa'ava of the Zohar. One category of KELIPAH is identified as Klipat Noga, translated literally as a KELIPAH, a force of Tumah that can be illuminated. This category of KELIPAH anti-Kedusha forces can be uplifted and refined. According to the Kabbalistic model, most of Olam Hazeh is underpinned by the forces of Klipat Noga. The role of the mitzvah is to elevate the physical entity to a state of Kedusha, and in the halachic world the term mutar is applied to these entities. The word mutar translates as unbound, in that it is an item that can be released from its Ruach Mesa'ava, Ruach HaTumah, and elevated to a level of Kedusha, a receptacle for holiness. The second category of are physical objects that derive their source, their energy, from what is termed as a shalosh klipot hatameyot, and in contrast to the klipat noga, these physical objects cannot be elevated, and hence the term asur is used. The term asur, the polar opposite to mutar, translates as bound, tied up. As we say in the first bracha of the Shemona Esrei, that God is matir asurim. These are objects that cannot be released from their state of tumah, and the only form of reformation or redemption is through their destruction. Even at this level, there are subcategories, hence the term shalosh klipot hatameyot, some less intense, while others 100% klipah. In other words, the concept of Ruach HaTumah is not a zero-sum game term. Either it is Kadosh or not. There is a gray area. And with respect to the issue of converting the KELIPAH forces of Eretz Canaan to make the land into a land that is Kadosh, we shall apply the two levels of KELIPAH. It could be argued that the average home in Eretz Canaan prior to the arrival of the Bnei Yisrael would be categorized as Klipat Noga. The transfer of ownership and certainly the placement of a mezuzah would elevate the building from Klipat Noga into Kedusha. However, the Canaanites were heavily involved in pagan worship. There must have been buildings, private or public, in which the Canaanites would practice their religion. Hence the question, both ancient and modern, can buildings that had been used for Avodah Zarah be converted / elevated, and as such would need to be dismantled, destroyed and rebuilt if they were to be used by the Bnei Yisrael. So although the Zohar maintained that the requirement for V'natati Nega Tzarat was motivated by the Omek Hara, the forces of Ruach HaTumah, and theoretically, in a zero-sum game, this should apply to every dwelling. The Rebbe suggests that this was not the case. The Venatati Neged Tzaraat would apply to buildings that were linked to the Shalosh Klipat HaTameyot that were used for pagan worship, and hence the Neged Tzaraat did not surface in every single dwelling. Which brings us to a strange anomaly, whereas on the one hand, the position of the Zohar is not in conflict with the Riboy HaTov position presented by Rashi, in that the Neged Tzaraat was limited to those buildings that had been used for pagan worship. But then, it was only in these buildings that you had the silver lining of Riboy HaTov, the financial gain that came from the destruction and rebuilding of these structures.